Days, an assessment of the Obama administration with Gail Collins and David Brooks of the New York Times. And I want to thank a few people before we get started. First, our benefactor, Dr. Marcia Robbins-Wilf, without whose continued support and dedication to Stern College for Women and Yeshiva University, none of this would be possible. And also to Dean Karen Bacon, whose dedication to the university and the college makes Stern College for Women and Yeshiva University truly a special place. And I thank all of you for coming. What I would like to do first is to introduce tonight's speakers. First is, since the poster had the order of David Brooks first and then Gail Collins, I'll introduce Gail Collins first and then David Brooks to even things out. Gail Collins joined the New York Times in 1995 as a member of the editorial board and later as an op-ed columnist. In 2001, she became the first woman ever appointed editor of the Times editorial page. And at the beginning of 2007, she stepped down and began to leave in order to finish a sequel to her book, America's Women: 400 Years of Dolls, Drudgers, Helpmates, and Heroines. She returned to the Times as a columnist in July of 2007. Before joining the Times, Ms. Collins was a columnist at New York Newsday and the New York Daily News and a reporter for United Press International. Her first jobs in journalism were in Connecticut, where she founded the Connecticut State News Bureau, which provided coverage of the state capitol and Connecticut politics. When she sold in 1977, the CSNB was the largest news service of its kind in the country, with more than 30 daily and weekly newspaper chains. Besides America's Women, which was published in 2003, Ms. Collins is the author of Scorpion Tongues, Gossip, Celebrity in American Politics, and The Millennium Book, which she co-authored with her husband, Dan Collins. And her new book is about American women since 1960 and will be out later this year. David Brooks' column on the op-ed page of the New York Times started in September 2003. He's been a senior editor of the Weekly Standard, a contributing editor at Newsweek and the Atlantic Monthly, and he's currently a commentator on the NewsHour with Jim Lehrer. He is the author of Bobos in Paradise, The New Upper Class and How They Got There, and On Paradise Drive, How We Live Now and Have Always in the Future Tense, both published by Simon Schuster. Mr. Brooks joined the Weekly Standard at its inception in 1995, having worked at the Wall Street Journal for the previous 9 years. His last post at the Journal was op-ed editor. Prior to that, he was posted in Brussels, covering Russia, the Middle East, South Africa, and European affairs. His first post at the Journal was as editor of the book review section, and he filled in for 5 months as the Journal's movie critic. Mr. Brooks graduated from the University of Chicago in 1983 and worked as a police reporter for the City News Bureau wire service, jointly owned by the Chicago Tribune and the Chicago Sun-Times. He's also a frequent commentator on NPR's All Things Considered and The Diane Rehm Show. His articles have appeared in The New Yorker, The New York Times Magazine, Forbes, The Washington Post, Times Literary Supplement, Commentary, The Public Interest, and many other magazines. He's editor of an anthology, Backward and Upward, The New Conservative Writing, published by Vintage Books. So what we're going to do tonight is we're going to first have a conversation similar to, although possibly a bit more serious and intense than the blog that Mr. Brooks and Ms. Collins co-authored for the Times. And then we're going to open to audience questions. There are, I believe, you've been distributed index cards in which you can write your questions and pass them to the aisle, and they will come forward, and we'll pick from those questions from the audience in the second portion of our program. Okay? So what I thought we would do is we would start off with just a general overview and first talk about how President Obama during the campaign referred to President Reagan as being a transformative president. And many have also referred to Franklin Delano Roosevelt as another point of comparison. Presidents like Reagan explicitly and some implicitly, like the most recent President Bush, Bush 43, have laid claim to a mandate. President Obama ran on a campaign of change. To what extent would you say that he has a mandate, and what is that mandate for? And has he himself actually made claim to that mandate, or is that something that has been given to him?
Okay, first, let me say, to be here is, I confess it's not my lifetime dream, but it's my wife's lifetime dream for me to be here. Life takes strange turns. One turn for me was I was born actually quite a liberal family. My parents were hippies in the 60s, took me to a bee-in in Central Park, which is where hippies would go to just be. And one of the things they did as part of their being was they threw money into a garbage can to demonstrate their liberation from material things. And I was 5 years old, and I saw a $5 bill in a burning garbage can, and I reached into the fire and grabbed the $5 bill and ran away with it, which was my first step over to the right. But another great turn, my great-grandfather was a kosher chicken butcher down on the Lower East Side, but up until that point, it was 100 years of assimilation for my family. I ended up at Grace Church School on 10th Street. I was part of the all-Jews boys davening choir at Grace. Married a Protestant woman. 3 years later, she converts to Judaism, becomes the mikveh lady at school. We send our kids to a Jewish day school. We keep kosher. We just had to spend my 12th trip in Israel. My line is that we know God must exist because only he would go so far out of his way to screw me this badly, drag me back. It's when she found out I was coming here, she was thrilled, and I'm pleased to be here too. And I promised Gail that I would not use my Jewishness against her to try to keep home court advantage. You know the definition of a conservative Jew is someone who has a kippah in his pocket. Anyway, on to Barack Obama. I have to say, I think he has a tremendous chance to be a transformative president. He's certainly taken off as much as it's possible to chew. I had a couple days ago, I had a White House staffer read to me his schedule day to day. And it was just in the course of one day. And it was a half hour on Afghanistan, an hour on the auto industry. It was 45 minutes on healthcare. It was, an hour of this, an hour of that. It was reorganizing the entire American economy. And I think his first achievement, he's put out more proposals in the past 98 days or whatever it is than most presidents do in a year. Now, will he achieve all this? I mentioned the other day that he's like a juggler who's thrown a million knives in the air. It'll get harder when they start coming down. But he certainly grasped as much as it's possible to grasp. And I would say his biggest single achievement in the first 100 days, which may lead toward this, is he has run a competent administration, which is to say he's 47, he has barely any experience in Washington. He was actually kind of mediocre as a senator. So it was not automatic that he would know how to put all this stuff together and make the trains run on time. And yet he has done that. It's a very efficient, smooth operating administration. And I think that people's sense of that gives him at least the potential to pursue the rest of his agenda, which, if fulfilled, would be transformative. And just finally, in this one sense, FDR was transformative because until him, people did not look to Washington naturally to solve problems. After him, they naturally looked to Washington. Obama could be transformative because he could change permanently the line between public and private. If the government can really reorganize the auto industry and healthcare and energy, then people will naturally look to government to do that kind of work, and that would be a big change.
And do you think that there is not just the question of whether there's going to be change, do you have a sense as to what the nature of that change is? Part of what Senator Clinton kept saying during the primary campaign was, okay, change, but change about what? In what direction are you actually talking about? And do you have some sense as to, if you were to try to define what it is that the administration is trying to do, other than trying to solve the myriad of crises that it faces, what would you say that mandate is going to be for?
Well, I tried to, when the campaign began and I tried to figure out what this was going to be about, I first thought it was going to be about a campaign about whether the country was ready to elect a woman president, which would have been great for me because I had all those women books. I could have cannibalized them all forever. That was my plan and hope. But it turned out not to be about that. It turned out not to be really about race, which was a great thing. And I thought then, by the end of the campaign, that it was actually about generational change, which I found to be deeply depressing because look how many, there were like 27 presidents from the World War II generation, I swear, and I thought I would get more than just Bill Clinton and George W. Bush, you know, from my generation, but it looked like that's going to be all, I think it is going to be all it is. But I also thought it might be generational because after Hillary Clinton gave me this idea, after she lost, I was talking to her, and she said very suddenly, Gail, the days you were on the campaign plane were the best days for me. And I knew there was a punchline coming, but I said anyway, well, why was that, Senator? And she said, because it was the only time there was somebody my age around. She claimed that she once was talking about Sputnik and nobody on the plane knew what Sputnik was. I don't know whether this is true. It might be apocryphal. But I think in the end, the reason that Barack Obama won was he won the primaries because despite the fact that his agenda was actually slightly to the right of Hillary Clinton's, he made people feel that he was for transformative change and that she was for 1992. And the people in the Democratic primaries voted for transformative change, of which he only gave them kind of an emotional charge rather than any specific idea of anything that was really different that he wanted to do. And then in the general election, although at that point his ideas were far more radical than anything John McCain had in mind, once we started getting in trouble, in particular, once the economic crisis hit, he convinced the people that he was the stable, calm one that they could rely on. So he basically got elected by convincing people that he was transformative and stable and calm at the same time, which is what he's got right now, and he's convinced the nation that he is, and it's very possible if he can maintain both the calm part that David just talked about and manage to get the agenda through, that's true. And the agenda that he's talking about now is in part the stuff that he talked about during the campaign, in particular about health care. During the campaign, he was actually less obsessed with health care, less into a dramatic change in health care than Hillary Clinton was. But as time has gone on, that's really become the defining goal of at least the first part of this administration. That's the thing beyond saving the economy that he's shooting for in this first term, this first year anyway of his term. And that's a huge, huge thing. But the other thing, which David has written about on occasion that he's homed in on here, is the whole idea of saving the middle class and shrinking the gap between the middle class and the very rich, which is more radical and something that he didn't really talk about that much during the campaign.
So how different is it from Clintonism of the Democratic leadership centrism of the focus on the middle class, on healthcare, on the middle class squeeze? Is there much of a difference? Is it a matter of calmness and stability and sure-handedness, or is there a substantive ideological difference?
Well, if you had asked Hillary during the campaign, she would certainly have said no. That's why the whole campaign was about, no, this is exactly the same stuff. It's different in that we're in a different place in time and history than we were back then. It's different in that the idea of health care, which for Clinton was, I think, a social goal, a fairness goal, has become for Obama sort of the center of his economic plan. I don't think his people believe they can really fix the economy, that they can really get to where they want to go, that they can really save any money, that they can really make the economy work right unless they get the health care.
So what does this mean for the Republican Party?
Which Republican? What
Yeah,
Republican
David.
Party?
Well, I think that's I think that's the question, which is, you know, there have been some academic scholars of the presidency who have talked about periods of time in which you have defining political agendas and they become paradigmatic, and then they at time will peter out or die, and then there will be a new president who will have that opportunity to redefine what that paradigm is going to be. So the question for the Republican Party is, where does it go now? Is it that Reaganism and its various manifestations and reactions to it, is it finally breathed its last breath? And if so, where is it now heading? And if not, how does it reinvent itself?
Yeah, well, I think it goes back to the last question, why was it different from Clinton? The Clinton presidency took place in a time of immense prestige for the free market. And so even though Clinton was a Democrat, it was still, with Robert Rubin, it was still essentially a free market based or deferential administration. I think the Obama administration has none of that. And that doesn't mean they're anti-market or anti-corporate, they're not. But they think, A, the problems are bigger than that, and B, the economic crisis basically delegitimizes the idea that the free market can be the leading institution in the country, and that it has to be supplemented by something powerful. And for the Obama people, it is supplemented by a responsible leadership class. I mean, the thing that strikes me most about the administration, and it's different certainly than Bush, but even in Clinton, there is a hothouse intellectual atmosphere in which certain people leap to the fore. And I think already in this administration, just hearing the conversations and seeing who is sort of an imperial hegemonic force within the administration, it's Rahm Emanuel, Larry Summers, Peter Orszag, the budget director, and Richard Holbrooke. And there's just sort of an intellectual self-confidence that we need to do big stuff. And even though a lot of them were in the Clinton administration, pretty much all of them, they still feel liberated to do more aggressive stuff than Clinton ever would have. And so they're real free to undertake the overhaul of the auto industry, energy, and all that stuff. And they are super intelligent. My line is that there are so many Harvard and Yale people in the Obama administration that if we're attacked during the Harvard-Yale game, we're screwed because they'll all be up there in New Haven. But the problem for the Republican Party is it is still essentially a Goldwater free market party oriented around maximum personal freedom. Well, that was fine if you were fighting the Soviet Union. It was fine if you were combating socialism. But it's not fine if you're combating an economic crisis that was in large part created by mistakes made by capitalists. It's not fine if you're combating inequality. So the Republican Party really has no voice on a lot of the most germane issues of the day. And to me, the one part of global conservatism that does have a voice is the British Conservative Party, which decided we are not going to be a radical free market individualistic party. We are going to be a communitarian, socially oriented party. We're not going to put economics first, we're going to put society first. And we're going to work on shoring up the institutions of society, and we'll make the Labor Party be the state, and we'll be the more community-oriented party. That's a viable way forward because it gives you something to supplement the free market with. The Republican Party, I take the maximalist view. I think they're 3 election defeats away from that kind of rebirth.
And are there any voices in the current Republican Party that's talking in those communitarian Cameron-type terms?
There are very few, certainly not in Washington. If you go and hang out, believe me, I do, with Republican senators and Republican House members, they all sort of want change. They know they screwed up really badly, but they just don't have the language, and they have the base problem. There is in part because of Rush Limbaugh, but in part just because of the nature of an old, tight party. There's no flexibility there. And so you look at John McCain, who was a person with a total contempt for the party process. The two parties have their lunches on Tuesdays in the Senate. And the Republicans go to a room, and the party leaders hand out something called the message of the week on a piece of paper. This is the thing the Republicans are all supposed to repeat all week to go on TV to hand the message. So McCain sits in the back of the room with his buddies, razzing, hurling insults, great message. He'll take the message, turn it into a paper airplane, throw it up in the air so it'll fly around. And yet when he ran for president, he turned it to Mr. Republican Message of the Week because the party just isn't ready to be flexible. It has to lose a few more elections. So I can think of a few governors, but that's why I think it's going to be a little while.
Do you think that they're destined for the wilderness, or?
Boy, they're not doing well right now. I mean, And you can't blame them. They lost the election, and it's a difficult time. But I've never seen a group of people who have less of a message or less of an agenda than these guys do right now. I mean, it's. But what you wind up with is after this next election, and I predict that Arlen Specter will lose the next election. You're going to have a moderate caucus in the Republican Party in the Senate made up of 2 women from Maine. I mean, that is really awful, but that's all they've got left. And it's partly all the things that David said. It's also partly, again, gerrymandering. I mean, if you create these districts in which everybody is a Republican or everybody is a Democrat, you're going to have the party that's the minority party made up only of the people in the truly nutcase districts who can get elected even if they walk around naked all day long. I mean, that's all that's left of them.
I'm trying to think of Arlen Specter naked now. Thank you for the image.
And I want to come back to a point that you had made earlier relating to the question of this being, it should have been an election for some of the first woman president. Where does that energy, where do those people go that had been so much a part of what had made Senator Clinton's or Secretary Clinton's campaign such a viable campaign?
There are different sort of groups that were behind that. There's one group of women who came out through the 60s, through the women's liberation movement, who spent the last 40 years talking about whether or not there's ever going to be a woman and saying, yes, yes, sometime in my lifetime, yes, yes, yes. And for them, this was a terrible, really heartbreaking defeat. They believed this was going to be their moment, and they had every reason to at the beginning, and it didn't happen, and they were so sad. I just, and I really felt, and everybody made fun of them, and they were all those crazy women and so on, and these were women who were just terrific people, and they were so sad, and I don't know whether, and they don't know whether they're ever going to actually live to see a woman president. I don't know. It could well be Hillary Clinton has just bounded back in the most spectacular way. I don't know what sort of mood or shape she'll be in at the point that Barack Obama leaves, but it's not inconceivable to me that she would run for president again.
And is there anyone else on the horizon?
No, but there aren't any guys on the horizon either, to tell you the truth. It's not like you look out there and say, there's the next, U.S. president. I mean, there's Mitt Romney is on the horizon, that's about it. Or Sarah Palin on the horizon. I know, yeah. It's not going to happen.
Did that help or hurt her selection?
Oh, it hurt over the long run. I think it just totally, I think about that now. I am so ticked off at Eliot Spitzer for picking David Patterson. You can just not imagine how I feel about John McCain picking, you can't be a person who thinks you might, whose insurance statistics suggest there's a chance you might not make it through a term or two, and pick somebody who is so totally, utterly, completely ill-qualified to be I'm not even sure about being governor anymore with this woman.
But what about, does it set back women's chances?
No, that's the great thing that Hillary Clinton did is that this is a really great country once they get used to something, whatever that something might be. They adapt really, really well. It's just that the getting used to period can be somewhat traumatic, but she got people used to the idea that it's perfectly reasonable to think of a woman as commander-in-chief. And that's, if she doesn't do anything else, that's her sort of great legacy. And Sarah Palin showed people that crazy women can be nominated for things like crazy men, and that, the people won't elect them, that's all.
And is there any chance for women in the Republican Party? As in serious leadership roles after Governor Palin's selection?
Well, Kate Bailey. I mean, there are women senators. I mean, I don't think the Republican Party has been discriminatory against women. If you look at the women in the Republican Party.
No, I'm just asking if there are leaders that
Kate
can
Bailey
lead the party.
I don't think Condi Rice is coming back.
Most of the women tend to be somewhat more moderate, and just because of that, I mean, why didn't they nominate Olympia Snowe for vice president? Because she was too moderate. You can't have it. I asked Olympia Snowe why they didn't nominate her for vice president, and she said something big like, well, John had to pick a person, and then wandered off, you know. That was the end of it.
So that statement is factually accurate, though. He did have to pick I think that's constitutionally true.
So moving on to much more serious and unfortunately much grimmer topics. In response to the financial crisis, the amount of money that has been dedicated to dealing with it, either in the financial sector or in terms of the auto industry, and whatever else might be coming down the pike, with the president meeting with the head of credit card companies that had very similar types of overtones, it seems, to when he met with the bankers. There's a question as to whether or not this is going to lead to what you had alluded to earlier, which is a redefinition of the relationship between market and state. And is this just going to be a pendulum swing back toward what had been the case before, or are we going to be looking at something that's going to be completely different than what has appeared in the past?
Well, first let me start with the amount of money, because I do think that is there are two things I worry about with Obama. The one is a self-confidence issue. We interview politicians. We're not unaccustomed to self-confidence. Obama, even by those standards, is just off the charts. He says, the one thing he said that was on the record was something he said that Ryan Lizza, the New Yorker, got, which was he was talking to an aide during the campaign, and he said to this aide, I want you to know I think I'm a better political director than my political director. I'm a better speechwriter than any of my speechwriters, and I know more about policy than any of my policy directors. Now, that's a level of chutzpah that is impressive. Mm-hmm. And that gets you to the presidency, but it also leads, I fear, to a degree of overreach, just because, you know, he's trying to redo healthcare, redo energy, redo autos, redo a million other things. That's just trying to reorganize half the U.S. economy with 8 people. And when you go to the Treasury Department, usually there are minions to escort you to get your interview with the Treasury Secretary, but there's nobody there. They haven't appointed anybody, so the guard at the front desk just says, oh, he's off that way. So you wander through these empty big halls, you knock on the door, Geithner's in there making coffee and trying to figure out. And so they're vastly understaffed. So that's my one big worry. But the second is the spending. He inherited this huge ramp up in spending. And spending was absolutely appropriate in the time of the recession. But we're now at 12%, a deficit of 12% of GDP, which is unprecedented in peacetime. For the next 10 years, we will be generating deficits of at least $1 trillion a year. That's in his budget. It gets worse when it gets to Congress, because Congress has taken away a lot of the spending cuts he had, like agricultural subsidies. It is also basically taking away a lot of his tax revenue ideas, like changing charitable deductions. It will, in almost all likelihood, take away the cap and trade thing that's part of his greenhouse gas proposal, which would generate $640 billion in revenue. Then he's got a health care plan which is less than half paid for. So he's had a very successful 100 days, but let's face it, he's done it by spending money we don't have. And so my big fear is that we will just ramp up huge amounts of debt, and this will be the lasting legacy. And this, by the way, is why the Europeans did not want to do a bigger stimulus of the G20. They just didn't think it was worth the debt. Now, to his credit, so that's my second huge concern. To Obama's credit, he's intensely aware of this problem. A big word for Obama is responsibility. He is, as Gail said, a very generational thinker. And one of the things he associates with the boomers is irresponsibility. And he thinks, I will be responsible. I will make the hard choices. And right now, within the administration, they are having a fight over how to show toughness on cutting the deficit. And Obama is the most deficit hawkish person in that group. But he hasn't done it so far. And I just think this ocean of red ink is just a tremendous, it's the big weakness in what he's proposed so far.
But what's the alternative?
Well, the alternative is to take care of the crisis and then figure out where
how do
you
do that without spending?
You spend a lot of money. I'm not saying, for the stimulus package, I would have done it all immediately. I would have had a big payroll tax cut. The money goes out immediately. You jolt the economy. And then once you finish the economy and you can establish some fiscal balance, then you take on energy, then you take on healthcare, then you do all the other stuff. Remember, in his first year, Franklin Roosevelt didn't do Social Security, he didn't do any of that stuff. He did the crisis. And then he put off the other stuff till the ensuing out years. Obama decided, I'm going to do it all at once. And that is the huge gamble of this administration. It will either prove to be a tremendous success for reasons Gail suggested, that they're interconnected, or it will be seen as an act of fatal hubris.
And do you think that he can instill that sense of responsibility that David was talking about in terms of Congress?
Yeah, Congress is definitely the problem. The Senate is the problem. The House is will basically do most of what Obama wants, whatever it is. But the trick he's got to do, and I think what I most disagree with David about is that if I was plotting out a responsible course, I would do exactly what Obama's doing. Obama absolutely does not believe, and I think most people have come to agree that you can't fix the economy without fixing the healthcare situation. That particularly because the big problem with healthcare, economically speaking, is the out-of-control costs of healthcare and how they keep escalating. And he doesn't believe you can really control those costs over the long run unless there's some kind of an integrated national healthcare system, not a national single-payer system, but something that's there, that's being organized, and that is trying to work together to bring things down, to coordinate, to get best practices, to do all the things that they're talking about right now. So for him to say that you're going to fix the economy and not fix healthcare is, it's like fixing the car but leaving a wheel off or something. Secondly, in our lifetimes and our political structure, he has not got forever to do stuff. Stuff that he doesn't do right now, really hard choices, aren't going to get done. The way they see this all happening is that they do health care, they do maybe energy, or at least a chunk of energy. They move it through, the deficit gets bigger, then they do their tax reform commission that's starting to work now under Volcker. That comes back with some reforms, and at that moment, you then throw down your gauntlet and force Congress to do something respectable. And I do think it's a version of gorge the beast. It's the opposite of what Ronald Reagan did when he cut taxes and figured that then he would force Congress to cut spending to go with the tax cuts, which he never did. I do think Obama thinks that the deficit is going to get to a certain point and Congress is going to be forced to raise taxes in some way, shape, or form, either by cutting loopholes or by simply raising taxes.
But didn't the starve the beast argument not work?
There's a difference between starve the beast and gorge the beast, which I have personally invented. Feel free to use it, anybody who wants. In that it's actually way, 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 way easier, although it doesn't seem like it, to raise taxes than it is to cut spending, because cutting spending always involves 10 trillion billion little tiny painful fights over something that's the most important thing in the world to one person, and nobody else cares, but there's all those persons out there in the Senate and the House. And it's just, you just look at them right now with their little tiny, what is it, $100 million they're trying to save or something. I mean, it's very painful to do even the tiniest amounts of savings because everything is a separate decision. It's actually much easier to do one swift shot of tax raising at some point along the way. You look
Do you want
pained.
I'm
Yes.
pained. I'm
Go
in the
ahead.
agony. This is the thing I think we do disagree the most. First, on whether you need health care to fix the economy, we had a crappy healthcare system and perfectly functioning credit markets for a long time. They're not connected. Second, if we're going to cut costs on healthcare, that's not going to help the economy. That's going to help contract the economy. So we probably shouldn't be doing it in a time of recession. And third, just politically on raising taxes, Obama promised, as thick a promise as it's possible to make, he would not raise taxes on the bottom 95%. That was a read my lips pledge. It would be very politically hard to do that, to break that promise. It would be politically extremely hard for every Democrat in a Republican district or in a Southern or moderate district to raise taxes. I just think it's it's phenomenally hard to raise taxes. I think it's also phenomenally hard to cut spending.
It's phenomenally hard to raise taxes, but I remember the first days of the Clinton administration in which, to a much, much smaller degree, we had the same problem. You had this, what seemed like at the time, a massive deficit. And you had a lot, at that point, things had gotten difficult enough, and partly thanks to Ross Perot, you really did have kind of a national demand that something be done about this.
And George Bush lost an election, and Newt Gingrich won an election.
But Bill Clinton won an election. Well, Newt Gingrich, I could argue many other reasons that he lost. But yeah, it's very dangerous and it's very hard. But I think if you have some political support from the populace, and that's really where the public is going to come in. I think it's really smart that Obama is not fighting over every little thing along the way. I think it's really smart that he gave in on the stimulus at the end. I think it's very smart that he's probably going to give in on health care, on the public part of it. I think it's probably very smart that he's given up on gun control. I mean, he's made many, many, many compromises already, and I think it's because he wants to save his big fight for one or two things. Now, there are things he's proposing that are so sensible that any rational human being, the idea that he's not going to win the fight to reform the scholarship, the college loan program, which, I don't know, you'd have to be crazy not to want to reform the college loan program. It's just lunatic right now, and they'd save all this money. But unless there's a huge popular outcry saying, save that, fix that program, save that money, make the loans more rational, it's not going to happen because there are very powerful lobbying business interests that don't want it to occur.
And to what extent do you think that what is motivating the agenda for the administration now is trying to just get their arms around this crisis, and how much of it is looking so much further down the road of trying to envision what in America is going to look like that is either going to be possibly, if it's from a democratic perspective, an emphasis more on justice and equity. Is there, because the criticisms that the administration is getting from the left is you're not moving fast enough, you only have 100 days, or you only have the first year in which to get these things done, and then your political capital is shot. And then the criticism he's getting on the right is, what are you doing? You're spending money at such a rapid pace that I can't even imagine, from their perspective, saying we can't even imagine what it's going to look like by the time you get done, because we're only in the first 100 days of this.
I think the main biggest thing, and David's right, I mean, Tim Geithner is like the one kid whose parents don't pick him up from boarding school for Christmas vacation or something. He's all by himself there in this big place. He's kind of wandering around, waiting for somebody to come and hang out with him. So he's got really short staff to be doing, and to be trying to make the decisions on the economy that he's making with the staff that he has, and the amount of hit the ground running he's had to do is just extraordinary. And that's certainly the first thing on his mind. But the other stuff, particularly healthcare, he's not letting that go a tiny bit, I don't think.
Now, another criticism that had come, and one of the reactions to President Obama's election, was abroad. And one of the major areas in which he wanted to make a very clear statement has come in the last couple of weeks, and that's on the question of torture. And as the story has unfolded, it has actually changed a bit. The position of the administration has changed quite a bit over time. First, of allowing the public to see some of what the internal discussions were, to say we're moving beyond what the previous administration had done to possible discussions of prosecution of certain people. But at the same time, they have still held on to the idea of holding on to some of that presidential power as it relates to state secrets, as it relates to some of those measures that have been put in by the Bush administration during a previous era. Can you sort of flesh out where the departure is from the previous administration, and to what extent this is a continuation?
Well, I actually think in many foreign policy areas there's a continuation, but in torture it's obviously not. They've had a clear reversal, and I'm actually pretty well informed on how they think about this torture issue. They felt they had to release the documents for legal reasons. Obama wanted to, many other people did not want to. And their view was that once you release the documents, you'll set off a firestorm that we will not be able to control. And that has indeed been the case. It is a firm commitment of the administration, a firm desire to not have prosecutions. And their view is that once you have prosecutions, it won't just be about torture, it'll be about the Iraq War, it'll be about everything. You'll spend a year relitigating the last 7. And this is the interesting part of their relationship with the left, which is they are not people of the left. They're Democrats, but they're not people of the left, even Obama, I think. And they have a high impatience with some of the causes that most animate people more on the left, and I'm oversimplifying here on torture, which offends people in all walks, but this is how they see it, and so they're trying to damp down this issue so they can move on. And I personally think that's the right thing to do. I think he's got bigger problems in foreign affairs. I think Pakistan is, I'm a big supporter of the Afghan policy, which is extremely ambitious in the Obama manner, but Pakistan, if Pakistan refuses to police their border, then Afghanistan will fall apart. The Iran policy is so unformed, it's unbelievable. They just don't know what to do about Iran. And so I think they're intelligently saying, let's focus on that, let's have our fights about that, let's not relitigate the Iraq War. But they are now being swept along for a period of time in the anger about torture.
And on the domestic, on all of the surveillance issues, on all the secrecy issues that had been put into place by the Bush administration as what had been been justified by them as some necessary measures, and former Vice President Cheney has been saying this within the context of the torture memos as well, as we kept the United States safe. But is there a problem for the Obama administration, particularly within the Democratic Party, over trying to walk on this knife's edge of trying to, on the one hand, say we're not going to do this anymore, but on the other hand, saying that we're going to continue doing some of these other things that the base of that party are just simply not going to be supportive of?
It's a very tricky situation, and I think one of the interesting things to me is that Barack Obama, who would never ever have become president if it hadn't been for his anti-war speech in Chicago, lo these many years ago, is actually right smack in the center of sort of traditional moderate centrist foreign policy-ness in this country. It was, everybody forget, I mean, how completely radical the shift was during the Bush administration. And he's basically just taken it back to that middle course. And I think he's got some incredibly smart people working for him there. And he doesn't have an Iran policy because his basic argument during the campaign was that we're going to go back to diplomacy, which is a no-brainer. But there is a problem with once you go back to diplomacy, it's still the same people who are out there and they're very hard to deal with. He's got a terrible problem with all of the domestic anti-terrorist stuff in that there are people who were picked up during the Bush administration who are really, really bad, who have been handled in such a way by the previous administration that there's no way you can try them anymore. And they don't know what they're going to do with them. I don't know what they're going to do with them. They're hoping France has volunteered to take one. I think that was great, but it's a very...
They're going to make him a waiter.
Yeah. It's a really tricky problem. I don't know what he does about some of these things, but I was surprised that he kind of backed away during that press conference the other day from his general, we are not going to go there, we are not going to go there kind of stance.
It was a mistake. He says it was a mistake.
And do you think that this is a recognition of the difficulties? Is it the difference between campaigning and governing? Is this seeing what the reality is now receiving those security briefings?
I think it's partly the reality thing, and I think it's partly that that's always the way he was. I mean, if you read his statements on foreign policy, they're mainly statements of A, we have to use diplomacy, and B, he hates dumb things. He hates people doing dumb things. He regarded the entire invasion of Iraq basically as a dumb thing. It wasn't like You can't be invading, you can't do a unilateral invasion. It was a dumb thing, period, full stop, and he never liked it from the beginning. But some of the stuff he just doesn't know what to do with.
Yeah, I will say, I think, and he said this, I had an interview with him about Lebanon. He said, he broke it off and said, you know, the foreign policy president I really admire the most is George H.W. Bush. And he talks a lot about Brent Scowcroft. And that is, as you say, a very centrist foreign policy. The thing that struck me in the past couple of weeks is when you ask people in the White House, you know, do these techniques, which we all oppose, do they actually yield actionable intelligence? And when I ask that question, I expect them to say, no, it doesn't work. But that's not what they say. They say, well, the answer is actually, it's ambivalent. It's hard to know the right answer to that. So that, when you're president of the United States, it's very hard to do policy if you've got a moral thing that may work.
He believes so much in transparency. I mean, that's the one consistent thought I think he's had about much of running government, is that if you make things transparent, if everybody can see what's happening, then it'll all work out. I think less about the rules and regulations parts of things than just let it open up, let everybody see it. That's very much what he did with the torture memo. But he pops up against the, you know, during the campaign, he would always talk about how with health care, he was going to have everybody sit down, including all of the lobbyists, all the major players, at a table, put it on C-SPAN, and let everybody negotiate, and then the country could see how the negotiations were going and who wanted what, and they could make their own judgments. Healthcare is being negotiated right now, and it's being negotiated in the Senate with Max Baucus and 27 lobbyists and a couple of Republicans. It's not happening the way he envisioned, and that's just one of the growing up and here's the real world things that happened. And if you ask them about it, they say, oh, we had the forum on healthcare, which was lovely, but it wasn't the same thing.
That's actually a good thing, though. I mean, as I mentioned, I think the competence with which they're doing everything is truly impressive. And I ascribe that a lot to Rahm Emanuel, who is not Mr. Transparency. I'll tell my two quick stories. One is an Obama line about Emanuel. Rahm is a very confrontational person. If you have dinner with him, every 8 minutes he erupts with some sort of fury, not at you, just at things. And one of Obama's lines about Emanuel lost his middle finger in a deli accident. And Obama says when Rahm lost his middle finger, he was rendered mute. The other line he says is Rahm cares intensely about the educational system and education reform. And the line is, Rahm is so intense about education because he's afraid that American students are cursing at a 4th grade level. Which is a good Rahm story. But Rahm, I think, he's a key player in the administration because he's actually not naive about Washington, quite the opposite. And he's the one doing a lot of the backroom deals and backroom negotiations, and some of this stuff is actually quite effective, but it's not the campaign stuff.
I just want to take a pause for a second. If people have questions that they wish to ask, in the next 10 minutes or so, we're going to start that segment of the program. So if you can write them and pass them to the aisles, and someone will come by and pick them up and pass them forward. On the foreign policy front, one of the first things that President Obama did was give his interview to Al Arabiya, and it has been repeated both in his Persian New Year message to Iran, and what seems to be the response, depending on what quarter you're talking about, has been complicated at best from what has come out of Iran. And the question is, where is this actually going to have some legs? Is this going to simply die on the vine because it requires a partner that is going to be involved in this dialogue? And one of the criticisms that had been made of President Obama during the campaign, both by Senator Clinton and by Senator McCain, was that you can only start to have dialogue if there is actually something to discuss, but that the idea of having dialogue for the sake of dialogue was not necessarily going to lead anywhere, and that they may, in some portion of their being, feel vindicated because of what has happened. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the degree to which this opening is actually going to lead anywhere, and where you think that this might end up going.
Yeah, I spent 2 weeks in Israel just until a few days ago and interviewed various people in the government there, including in the foreign ministry, which is, I would say, the most confrontational part of the government. And what struck me about the conversations was they were all fine with the dialogue. It was inevitable, it was going to happen. The argument was over when you set a deadline to end it. I think their assumption, which was correct, was that there will be a dialogue, they will fail, and the question is, what do you do next? And I think that's really what people are trying to figure out, what you do next. And I personally think, my own personal opinion is hopeless. We don't know much about the Iranian government, but we know every single person in it wants to have a nuclear weapon. We don't know much about Chinese and Russian policy, but we know they're not going to really put an embargo on Iran. And therefore, within a short period of time, Iran will have a nuclear weapon. And the result of that will, A, be to galvanize and totally change the psychology in the Middle East as people around in the region, especially in the Arab countries, look to Iran as the champion that actually does something. And then as Egypt and Saudi Arabia and all the other countries feel the need to have a nuclear bomb. And then as Israeli public opinion turns, it'll make Bibi Netanyahu, he'll be peace now, because the Israeli public opinion will shift. And so I'm extremely pessimistic about what's going to happen. Now, I do happen to think Iran is deterrable. I don't think they're going to launch a nuclear weapon into Israel, but it's one of the things that strikes me, just being there this time, though it always strikes me, is that people have processes, peace processes, that are oblivious to realities on the ground. One of the realities on the ground is that Iran is making steady progress toward a nuclear weapon, and nobody's going to stop them.
And one of the concerns that Dennis Ross, who's now heading up the effort by the administration to deal with Iran,
I wish he were heading it up.
Is that his concern is that there's a limited timeline, and the timeline is somewhat being set by the Israelis as much as by the Iranians, and that at a certain point the Israelis are going to run out of patience and are going to become increasingly concerned, and that it's at that point that the United States will no longer have control over anything that is, or influence on anything that is going on. Is there any, do you see any chance that any of this dialogue, for example, is going to help bring the Europeans along to possibly, because I know at a lunch that I was at last week, someone had asked me whether or not this had any chance of survival, and one of the parts of the discussion was about the degree to which this takes away the excuse from the Europeans of saying, you're not talking to them, you're not trying to act constructively toward them. Does this open up any chance? Is there going to be any greater cooperation from the Europeans in putting pressure on the Iranians, do you think?
It would be pretty to think so. It's hard to imagine. I mean, I'm sure they'll try a little harder. They'll talk a little more. They'll be perhaps a little more intense. But I agree with David that it's very hard to imagine a scenario under which this bomb does not get built. And I have to say that neither Clinton nor McCain had actually a good plan for how to not make this bomb get built either. And the idea of blowing up the bomb before it gets built would be a terrific idea if it was actually possible to find said bomb and get rid of it in one fell swoop, which I have not met anybody who actually thinks is going to happen. So really all of anything easier than reslogging this whole thing through arguments. The people who are most scared, of course, of the Iran bomb thing are the Saudis, I think, even more than the Israelis, perhaps, that the idea of having this neighbor with a bomb, it just scares the bejesus out of them.
That's a metaphor.
So yeah, it's going to be a long thing, and I think one of the things in Obama's head is that you're going to have to be thinking about a whole new paradigm in which there are more countries that have bombs, but there's a larger, wider, international, global effort to disarm everybody. And that's, I think, part of the reason he's moving in the way he is so quickly new treaties on disarmament, but it's a long,
It-
long,
It
painful
will be
process.
a shock, though, when, if it's under, for anybody, and I agree, nobody had a solution, but if you're the president under which Iran gets the bomb,
Yeah.
that's just going to be a big shock. And I have to say that, too, the one thing that worries me is that I think as we talk to Iran, there's a natural process of assuming they're more moderate than they are, just because if you're talking, you want to feel your partner's moderate. And so there's a psychological shift in our perceptions of what Iran is really like. And one feels that underway. And the second thing to be said is, I would say, my perception, if you ask them to rank their worry spots, Iran is actually number 2 after Pakistan, which the bomb already
Which already
exists.
has a bomb, yeah.
And given what has happened in the past couple of weeks, both in Pakistan and in Afghanistan, particularly as relates to women, raises the question of, with President Karzai in Afghanistan and with Benazir Bhutto's widower in Pakistan, signing pieces of legislation or agreements that are going to help to institute policies or legal norms that are completely at odds with the entire spectrum in the American public. Where does this leave the Obama administration?
You know, I don't think they've actually come to grips with this themselves, but I think that we're moving down a path in which the women of Afghanistan get thrown under the bus in an attempt to find some kind of a solution there that does not involve our staying in massive forces for the next 27,000 years. All the talk about we're going to work with the Taliban, we're going to find the good Taliban, and the good Taliban will be just like Iraq, we'll work together. All that stuff, it's the same thing that's going on in Pakistan, and all I can see is all of these women who are having a terrible time to begin with, just completely being abandoned in our attempt to be pragmatic about all this.
Do you agree that this is going to be
yeah,
the
we've
price?
talked about this. I'm a little less pessimistic. I think, well, let me put it one way. I think it's possible that we're throwing them under the bus. We're going to tolerate that. The only caveats I would make is, A, I was just struck by the day when they had in Kabul, they had a rally of women protesting against this new law. The rally of people in favor of it was 3 times as large. And so I don't know what the culture's like. The second thing there, and this is the case I've made, which is an ugly case to make, is our main concern is not getting killed, not getting Americans killed. And if it means not offending them on this issue, that might be, this might be the horrible, this is, I feel like I'm the sort of people who put up with tolerance of the Soviet Union's suppression of dissidents, so maybe I should shut up. But mentally, I made this case, well, let's worry about first things first. The first thing is the nuclear bomb. The first thing is not getting Americans killed. And maybe we'll worry about that other stuff later, though that is a horrible position, which I acknowledge. The second point is that I would say is wherever there are Americans, and I think we're going to be there a long time. My kid just enlisted in the Marines, and he wanted to do it before college so he can get to Afghanistan. And after I came back, I told him, you could go to college, you could go to med school, you could go to law school, we'll still be there, you'll have plenty of time. But I would say everywhere we are an influence on that society. And not only us, the UN, there's huge European presence, the European social programs are better than ours in general. And it is a presence on the whole society, especially the women. And so I do think our presence will be long-standing, it will be deep, and it will have a very pervasive effect on Afghan society for the better. Pakistan, maybe not so much.
So does this shift to this centrist return to realism mean that not only are women thrown under the bus, but values in general in terms of the running of foreign policy? Because this is not only the case for the neoconservatives, this is also true for the human rights community that is a part of the base of the Democratic Party.
But see, I would say my line would be that Gail's right, he is a very centrist Council on Foreign Relations type. But if you look at where foreign policy is moving, the biggest and most important shift is something being led by Hillary Clinton, led by Bob Gates, led by Jim Jones, which is to get everybody involved in nation building. And one of the things that struck me in Afghanistan was when you talk to the generals, and these are tough guys from the 82nd Airborne, all they want to do is talk about police forces. And the idea that Gates and Clinton and Jones have cohered around is that it's wrong to have a military over here that blows things up. It's wrong to have a State Department that does high diplomacy. The key in both these fields is not high diplomacy, it's not blowing things up, it's building capacities of local governments in places like Afghanistan and Iraq. And that's the core of what we do as a foreign policy power. And so that's actually not ignoring human rights. And I will say, just talking to the Israeli government about the West Bank, I heard over and over again, it sounded like I was talking to Gates or Clinton. It was, we can't just have a peace process, we have to build capacity in the West Bank, we have to build economic development, social development, police forces, and it was very much the same. So it's not a sort of a radical foreign policy, but it is heavily involved in nation building.
And given all of the budget demands that there is in the United States, you had mentioned that the budget deficit is going to get to 12% of GDP. That was unprecedented in peacetime, but we're not in peacetime. We've got two wars that are going on simultaneously, and a significant portion of that budget deficit and the larger national debt with the deficit, hitting $1 trillion, the CBO said, for what, the next 10 years. How are we going to be able to engage in any of this kind of nation building when we're going to be running these kinds of deficits? Is that even a realistic possibility?
Well, certainly we're supposed to be out of Iraq. I mean, they've got that in the budget 9,000 different ways.
But having it in the budget and actually doing it are two.
Well,
very
it's not even
things.
in the budget. I mean, it's even worse than that. I think David's right that that's, unless you count the fact that the women are going to remain in subjugation in about a quarter of the populated part of the hemisphere. Other than that, they're committed to that, and I don't know. They've got money for it right now. That part of it is in the budget. I don't know down the road whether, if people get really ticked off, if things go badly economically 2 years down the road, whether you're going to see masses of people saying, why the heck are we in Afghanistan when we don't have any jobs in Detroit? Maybe that's possible. For right now, I think it's pretty much
And do you
on the
think
agenda.
that Secretary Clinton is going to be the person that's going to be pushing the women under the bus?
No, no, I don't think that would be her plan, but I do not see anything else happening out of the agenda that we're pursuing. And it's the end product of an original agenda of the Bush administration that was so completely off the wall as far as the realities on the ground in Iraq when we began this whole adventure, that it sort of led us to this place that we're at right now.
Now, the other part of President Obama's approach to the Arab and Muslim worlds was getting back to, the Obama administration would say, to dealing with the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, the appointment of Senator Mitchell as the special envoy, and his listening tour. And
that man can listen forever. He is the best listener, Brian. Just sits there and listens.
Now, for a while, it was waiting for the Israeli cabinet to finally form after the Israeli election took place in February. But are we going to is this going to go anywhere, or is there going to be this sudden start and then this almost serious stop? Or if President Obama says that his model for foreign policy is the H.W. Bush administration, it's the same administration that held up $10 billion in loan guarantees to the Shamir government when the Shamir government wasn't going to go to the Madrid Peace Conference. Is that the direction that the Obama administration is going to be heading in?
Well, they're certainly going to be a lot tougher on the settlements. There's certainly no love lost between the Netanyahu government and the Obama government. But I do think there's a recognition that A, you need to have the appearance of a peace process to keep everybody sort of happy as sort of a shock absorber. It's your sign of seriousness to your Arab friends. And C, that there's no possible chance of it succeeding. I mean, Hamas is there. I mean, one of the things you talk about Hamas, and then you talk about the peace process, and it's as if they're in two different parts of the world. The fact is there's going to be no peace because you don't have a partner, even if the Israeli government was run by the best possible people on earth, you would have no peace process. And I think they have to know that. But the ability, and I go there every year, and there's always a process. There's the Mitchell, the quartet, the Oslo process, I don't know, all the other, the Alone Plan. I mean, there's always a process. It never actually goes anywhere. And maybe the process has its own rewards. It creates conferences and a lot of bookings for the King David. But I think they have to know the process is not going anywhere as long as Hamas is there. And their main effort practically is just to keep Hamas out of the West Bank.
But hasn't some of the discussion been, you've got a very short timeline until the next major explosion is going to take place. And there's also been this discussion of whether or not there is that a two-state solution, which the Obama administration favors, is pretty much on life support at this point, that there is a limited amount of time in which that's going to work until people on both sides of this issue are going to finally say.
It doesn't change the fact that Hamas exists.
Okay. So what I wanted to do now is to open up questions from the audience. One is a question that relates to what the world would be like different if the election had turned out very differently and there had been a President McCain rather than a President Obama. I was wondering if you could speculate on what you think how he would have been dealing both with the economic crisis as well as trying to rebuild America's relations with different parts of the world.
David is the great McCain expert of the world, and I'm going to defer to him entirely on this. All I know is Sarah Palin would be vice president. It would be very, very bad.
No, I think she'd be running Citigroup by now. You know, I've actually kept it a secret who I voted for. I love McCain. He's a great guy. We covered him in 2000. It was the most fun I ever had covering anything.
It was a great campaign, guy.
And he is, you know, he took me to shoot craps once at a casino. Not many politicians will take a journalist to shoot craps, so one respects that. But would he, I will say two things. First, he is phenomenally honest. He'll do things that are cheap and bad, but he will tell you how cheap and bad they are. And I also respect that. He is not a domestic policy person. You'd see him, they'd hand him a speech to give on some economic issue, and they'd say, you know, you really should read it before you deliver it. And he would throw it in the chair of the plane and say, no, I'll get to it, I'll get to it. So he really, if you could talk to him about any part of the world, and he would know every foreign leader, but domestic policy was just not his natural instinct. And so how would he have done with this set of crises? The fact is, probably not as well, not nearly as well. I think he would not have spent as much money as Obama, and he may be proved right about that. But handling things like the banking crisis, the auto crisis, frankly, it's just hard for me to see him doing it. And I think I think Obama's ability to absorb 800 facts about whether the Chevy Volt is priced right for 5 minutes, and then to absorb 800 facts on the, gee whiz, the greatest wind farm on earth, that's actually needed right now. And so it's hard for me to imagine McCain doing all that stuff.
There really was that, when I thought about the generational thing, I also thought about McCain in the sense that when you hit a certain age, you tend to start doing the thing you do well even better, but you are less good about shifting and doing something you've never done before. And in that campaign, he came to run for Iraq and on conservative fiscal policies, and particularly earmarks, God help us. But he couldn't get off of that. And when the economy fell apart, he appeared to be a man in genuine distress. You know, he certainly wanted to do the right thing. And just none of his brain patterns, none of his synapses, none of his previous history, nothing in being a soldier or being a senator it just wasn't there. And it did make me think at that point in time, you know, this is a guy who is not too old to do a whole bunch of things, but I think maybe he's too old to be president of the United States.
And it should be said, you know, many people never recover from losing. John Kerry, if you talk to him, he will literally talk to you for an hour about what he would have done if he was elected. And it's hard, you know, the country sort of rejects you. McCain, on the other hand, is as happy as I've ever seen him. It's like, thank God I got that over with. I mean, I had to run. Everyone wanted me to. I was the big hero. But he is a very happy and productive senator all of a sudden. He can go back to screaming at people. It's, you know. So it's part of his natural balancedness that he's now a good senator.
George McGovern told me once he ran in Walter Mondale somewhere, and Mondale said, "When do you get over it, the losing thing?"
Yeah.
And McGovern said, "Never."
Yeah.
It's going to go on 20 years from now. You'll still be suffering, and
Right.
it was really cheered Mondale up a lot. But that's.
I do know one Mondale story that's interesting is
I
that
can't believe you've got a Mondale story. That's incredible.
it was Mondale and two rabbis walk into a bar. No, it was Mondale. If you remember the first debate with Reagan, Reagan was terrible, and Mondale was actually leading in the polls. And he walks off the stage, and his staff gathers around him and says, "You killed him. You're going to win this election." And he smiles. And then he goes back with his issue director, and he says to his issue director, "You know, I'm not going to win this election." So even at the high points of the election, Mondale knew he was going to lose, and this is something he'd been building to his whole life.
To lose?
Well, to win, but you know, these guys. At some sense, there's a sense of realism and a sort of a pathos to it. I mean, my view of politicians is they are all emotional freaks of one sort or another. They have a terror of being alone. They need physical contact. I always say they're guaranteed to invade your personal space. They touch you. I had dinner with a Republican senator at one of the conventions. He had his hand on my inner thigh the whole time. But he's about to be an ex-senator. I won't tell you who. One more story on that. I once saw Ted Kennedy and Dan Quayle meet on the well of the Senate while I was up in the press gallery, and they hugged, and they were good friends, and they stayed hugging, and their faces were this far apart, and they were rubbing each other's backs and moving and talking and laughing, and I was like, get a room, I don't want to do it.
Can I tell one more story about the touching thing? The weirdest time, the only time George W. Bush, I think, ever came to the Times for like an interview, at least in his presidential mode, was when he was first running in 2000. He did come for an interview, and even though he knew he wasn't going to be endorsed, I think he was just doing it because he had to do it. So there's this huge meeting. There's all these people there. You know, we're in the big dining room upstairs. And he's sitting next to the publisher, as is our tradition. On the other side is Bob Herbert, and you all know Bob Herbert. Bob is sitting there. Bob has not been kind to George W. Bush during this campaign at all. And Arthur asked the first question, and Bush turned to Bob and started talking to Bob, and then started kind of petting Bob. And Bob is totally freaked out, and he kept pointing to the publisher and saying, "He's talking," you know, and Bush would say, "You want me to talk to your boss, do you?" And he's really laying over there. He spent the entire afternoon kind of hugging Bob Herbert, and I've never seen Bob Herbert like at a loss in my entire life except that day. It was the most amazing sight. And even today, if Bob gets really cranky or difficult, I will just remind him of the George Bush day, and he just instantly goes like that.
So there have been a number of questions related to politicians, since we're talking about that now. One is what seems to have been the lost Vice President Biden, that he had been put on the ticket because he was going to be the experienced hand at foreign policy, since then Senator Obama did not have that experience. And yesterday was unveiling the Obama administration's new policy on more green buses to go into the transportation system as a part of their energy policy. Where is Senator where is Senator Vice President Biden in President Obama's administration?
Tell me if you think, I'm not, you think you may know more, but my impression is strongly that he, does get to be in on some of the big meetings where stuff is being discussed. And I think does feel he's got a place, and he meets with Obama once a week and stuff like that. But as far, The foreign policy arena is really crowded in this administration. There are 9,000, people and special envoys and everybody else. And I don't think he's, except for those moments in which he's at the big meetings, has much to do with foreign policy. But I also have the very strong impression he is happy as a clam. What do you think?
I agree. Well, he likes the buses. I think he's going to Romanian National Day tomorrow. That'll be a good day. The national badminton team is coming in. No.
But he likes to do that
he
stuff,
likes,
actually,
no, he does seem happy. I've actually been wondering. I haven't spoken to him. Well, I've spoken to him on the phone, but not in person. So I don't know. Like, I want to ask him, what are you doing? But I would say if I go back over my head of conversations as people describe when what decision was made, he's rarely mentioned. The only case I know where there was a big Biden push was on Afghanistan, whereas our paper reported he was against the policy, and he obviously lost that one. So my sense is, A, he's happy, but B, he's not making the big decisions. And I do think because he lacks what Obama values, which I mentioned at the very beginning, which is the kind of intellectual incandescence that a Larry Summers or Holbrooke has. And I think it's those guys, the guys who can dominate a room with just pure intellect, who tend to win the arguments. And Biden has many virtues. I admire him on balance, but that's not one of them.
And given that Vice President Biden said that the one thing he did not want to be was his predecessor in terms of the type of vice president and understanding the role of the vice president, there have been a couple of questions relating to the degree to which what happened in the Bush administration was the result of Vice President Cheney's involvement, and to what extent is this owned by former President Bush? Is this especially in light of some of the comments that former Vice President made over the last week?
I got to say, no matter what happened in this administration, it is hard for me to imagine, even if he wanted to, Joe Biden being able to play the kind of role that Dick Cheney did. I mean, that was something that George W. Bush allowed to happen, I think even encouraged to happen.
Yeah, I guess I would say two things. There's an evolution of the Cheney-Bush relationship. In the beginning, well, throughout it all, no one knows what the Cheney power was, because Cheney never spoke at a meeting. He never exerted himself in public. Everything he did was in private. And people assumed that Cheney was running the administration because they assumed Bush was too stupid and he wasn't doing it. I never quite bought that. Bush is extremely self-confident. In the beginning, it was very hard to tell what they were doing. I never really thought Cheney was running things. By the second term, I'm positive Cheney was not running things. A, because Bush administration people began to talk very negatively about Cheney. One of them, a senior person, told me, one of the problems we have here is we have a little Nixon administration stuck inside our own administration, and that's the Cheney operation. And President Bush began to do, he has a Cheney impersonation he began to do more in public, or not in public, but with more people. And that suggested to me a level of disdain for Cheney, which wasn't there in the first term, but was there, I think, in the second term.
Well, the disdain thing seemed to happen about the time that the Bush foreign policy became less crazy.
Yeah.
I mean, so I think there's a real connection.
Well, it could be, but it could be, well, it took him forever to make a judgment on Rumsfeld, too. And they made the judgment more or less together. Rumsfeld, he could get rid of, Cheney, he couldn't.
Now, many administrations are usually some sort of a reaction from their predecessors. And one of the things that the Obama administration has done, and a number of people have asked about this, has to do with the vetting process that the Obama folks have been putting people through.
David hates the vetting process.
And I even heard stories of people who had already been decided upon, who had already been vetted, and now are going through the process yet a second time, and that this is slowing things down. Have they set standards too high?
Yes.
You have to.
The short answer is yes. I mean, there are two problems. One is no lobbyists. There's some lobbyists who are sleazy. Most lobbyists are perfectly good people who actually know a lot about policy. The second problem, and this is Obama's argument, is that the problem is 80% of Americans at a certain income level do not pay their taxes correctly. And what they're finding over and over again, is people they want egregiously not paying their taxes. There was one woman who was going to be sort of the head efficiency officer of the government, who she was dinged out on like an $800 thing she owed, which is absurd. I mean, I'm for corruption. I am a pro-corruption person. I'm, you know, in the old Chicago days, Richard Daley, not Richie Daley, was plenty corrupt, but perfectly fine. You can go overboard. Nixon, maybe a little too far. Tammany Hall, a tints over the top. But I'm for bastards who can do the job. And they have set the bar so high that they just can't get anybody. And then they're running them through bureaucratically through the ringer. And then the third thing is, if you join the administration, you have to not only take a pay cut, you've got to sell out all your stocks, especially in the company you're in. So they're asking people to take an 80% pay cut in some cases if they're from here, and then basically sell all their stocks at the worst moment in their life. So not only destroy income, but destroy savings. And so they're just not getting people. And it's just a madness.
And good government?
I think they argue that a lot of the tax stuff is actually coming out of the Senate, and that they're only trying to protect their people from the Senate auditors who come after their auditors, which is possible. I wouldn't argue that. I'm into the transparency thing. I think people in this country are capable of understanding that people screw up on their taxes. And if they screw up on their taxes in a way that you look at it and you think, oh my God, I could imagine doing that. Or, oh my God, that's kind of dumb, but life goes on. Then I just think you let it be out there, let them pay it back and move on. For Tom Daschle, which was very much mixed up into the whole, he went into the private sector and then tried to cash in really fast and stuff. I think they should have, once they realized anything close to what was going on there, they should have made him a special aide to the president or something that didn't require cabinet confirmation and let him go on and do the job like that. Some of the stuff could have been handled better. Some of the stuff they should have just taken the bite and let the people go through. And it's every administration has a hard time with this stuff. I don't think they're way behind the actual time level that a normal administration would take to fill these things. I think it's just because we have such a mess now that you're so conscious of the fact that Tim Geithner is home alone every day, in his office.
Well, is it that, or is it that the Obama folks, before they took office, prided themselves on having put together at least the cabinet level, or most of the cabinet level appointments done well in advance of all of their predecessors, and made a point of saying that President Clinton hadn't even come close to what it was that they were doing, that they first raised the bar for speed and then raised the bar for clean government, that put them in this kind of situation.
Yeah.
And is there going to be a long-term policy effect of all this? It's one thing to think about Secretary Geithner sitting alone in the Treasury Department. It's another thing of Treasury Geithner sitting alone, having to both deal with the banks and the credit card, which is on the horizon, and Chrysler announcing that they're considering bankruptcy, and a possible orderly bankruptcy of General Motors. And all of this is happening, and there isn't necessarily the staff there that are going to make the decisions.
Yeah, it's not so much decisions, because it takes 10 people to run an administration. If you're not in the room in the morning meetings, you're not making decisions. So the decision-making is very tightly controlled in every administration. It's actually the execution of policy once the decisions are made. And so, for example, the Energy Department, they're trying to they've got all this money from the stimulus package, but they're still giving out grants that were appropriated in 2005 because the process is so slow, because they want to, not have too much corruption. And so it's getting people to actually execute policy that they're way behind on. And this, by the way, is another of my pet peeves with the administration. They have so many people who are academic economists. They think that once you plug it into the model that we're spending this amount of money, well, then it goes through the model very quickly. But it actually doesn't go through agencies very quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And they sometimes assume an agency is just part of a macroeconomic model. And that's where the problem's going to be.
There have been a couple of questions about the media, which every time I've heard journalists talk about themselves, they always get very uncomfortable, or about the way in which they're handling things. And there are two sets of questions. One is whether or not the way in which the media has been covering the financial crisis is created a situation in which the entire financial services industry has been put under indictment, and therefore anything that's going to be sensible, or trying to figure out ways in which to make it work better but not necessarily eviscerate it, if there's anything to the idea that some of this is as a result of the way in which the media has been covering it, not only talking about the substance of what's going on, but the degree to which the broader media has been focusing on and lending itself to the running from crisis to crisis, because that makes good news.
Let me say, put a preface on this, which is the other complaint that I hear a lot is that why didn't the media pick up on all this stuff that was happening ahead of time? And in fact, they did. I remember Teresa Tritch, who's on the editorial board at the Times, was writing about the upcoming housing crisis 3 years ago, you know, and she has her editorials she carries around with her now, because she was and she was hardly the only one, at least as far as the housing bubble was concerned. There was tons of coverage, really, about what was going on, the, you know, flipping of houses, the easy access of mortgages, and so on. We live in a time in which it's very easy. There's a proliferation of media, most of which is undercapitalized. And by that I mean, if you've got media that has, you know, a massive capitalization, if you're the New York Times or somebody like that, that has stockholders and that has, you know, huge amounts of money that can be sued, you have a certain tone normally, just because you've got a lot to lose, you've got a lot of advertisers to not completely drive over the deep end and so on. If you're a blog that cost you $3 to set up and you're competing against all the other blogs in the world, or if you're a news channel, a network news channel goes on 24 hours a day that's competing against 3 other network news channels, and they're on 24 hours a day, and God knows how many other voices out there. Times like this, and it's happened in our country other times, we just don't remember it because we were not around. The media gets really, really, really shrill because everybody's competing for attention in a really huge crowd, and many of those who are competing are incredibly, you know, don't have anything to lose no matter what they say. So everything, not just this coverage, but everything about the media now is incredibly loud and shrill, and it's not because we've lost our moral compass, it's because of the nature of the economic beast right now. That being said, the coverage, the stuff that happened was so irresponsible on the part of a certain select number of people in the financial world that it naturally made people crazy. Politicians responding to that behaved behaved inevitably in the way they're always going to behave, but there were certain occasions, especially when it came to those AIG bonuses at the end when the 90% bill was going through, and when you turned on TV, you saw politicians competing to sound crazier because they just had that sense right then that their constituents would reward them if they came out with pitchforks and hammers, and they didn't help at all. And to the extent that the media contributed to that, it's unfortunate. But it was a brief period. People calmed down faster than I actually thought they were going to. That's my basic take.
Yeah, I think the coverage of this story has actually been pretty good. There have been some outstanding stories of what happened at the London office of AIG and all that kind of stuff. And as for sort of a pitchfork crusade, well, it is a fact the American people are giving over $1 trillion to banks. And most media people, myself included, support that. And so, you know, I don't think the climate is not so hostile that we're not massively bailing out the banks.
Well, not that Jon Stewart is the public ombudsman for
he basically runs the world now.
The media, but his indictment of CNBC in his interview of Jim Cramer was really quite remarkable. And if you bookend that with Rick Santelli's outburst on CNBC, and see that as both a reaction to it and possibly what Stewart was saying was, at least for some of the financial media, particularly those that are on television, that for the most part they were cheerleaders for or platforms for various investment advisors to get on to say that the world is wonderful, or making entertainment out of what is very serious and for some people dry bits of news. And so the question then becomes, what does this say in terms of where it is that we're going to be going as far as the media is concerned and the coverage of this, not flitting in between these horror stories, and then not paying attention to what's going on that lays the foundation for such a crisis?
Well, we'll be doing both. I mean, there'll be the media that's paying all the attention to the foundations and the crisis and so on, and then there's going to be the media that's running around looking for the rogue banker of the week that they can. And Jon Stewart will still be the person that people always quote. And Jim Cramer, I could not believe how he rolled over. I mean, I never saw anybody look so guilty in my entire life. That was just extraordinary.
Stewart, because it's his business to make fun of cable, he watches cable all day. And he watches 3 channels of it. So he's actually a little more obsessed by it. I mean, there are more people who own ferrets in this country than watch Fox News. It's just not that huge a market. I mean, CNBC is tiny. So it's there. Cramer has a show. I actually, on the NewsHour, when we're getting our makeup done for the NewsHour, Cramer's on TV with the volume off. And with the volume off, I find him hilarious. He's just fantastic. And Santelli, by the way, the administration bashed Santelli the first day. By day 3, they were totally echoing his line. They understood he was saying something a lot of people felt. And so, you know, we all consume different parts of the media, and we do it in a different mood. I remember when I used to work at the Journal, the New York Post would come into the office. This was back when it was really afternoon paper. Would come into the office at 4. The entire newsroom would go silent because we'd go to page 6. And we all consume it, it's fine, and we all know what's valuable and what's not, or at least most of us do. And my basic prejudice, though I'm in this business, is that the media is rarely to blame for massive shifts in public opinion. And my bit of evidence came from when I went to a conference of sexologists at Michigan State University, a more boring group of people you never want to meet. And one of the things they pointed out to me was that we all think there was this big change in sexual attitudes in the 1960s because media coverage of sex really did change dramatically in that time. But they said the change in behavior in the 1960s was relatively minimal. The big change in behavior was in the 40s and the 20s. It was the world wars that really changed behaviors. It was actual behavior changing behavior. It was sending people to France that changed behavior. Even a radical change in media coverage of sex did not change actual behavior. And I do think it's generally true. People can read media quite a lot and actually not change their views because they have their own views which are very deeply ingrained. So I'm generally not a big believer that what we do is dramatically change behavior. I think what we sometimes do, especially in Gail and my business, is try to crystallize thoughts that are half-formed. But I don't think we radically shift opinion.
Well, there's we don't.
Krugman
does. Krugman does every day. God, Krugman walks and people die. Whenever I go into the administration, it's like you want them to say, "Oh, I read your comments," but what they always say to me is, "Why does Paul Krugman hate us so much?" It's like their obsession. Paul and David, they're obsessions in life. They want David to love them, and they just want Paul to stop hating them somehow. But it's true about it. Well, one thing that it is that right now, if you pick up on some little thing and mention it 500 times, it will become a thing in the mass media. Which, that's not us. That's the regular reporters, and that is a fun. And the other thing is that the difference now between one of the most profound differences in our lives now and life in America when I was growing up is that there used to be 3 channels. And whether you liked what was on TV or not, everybody had the same references. Everybody watched basically the same TV. Everybody watched the same news, and everybody read basically, even if it was a different paper, they all were pretty much alike, frankly. Everybody got the same stuff, and our context and our frame of reference was so general that we could have conversations and always pick up on everybody's now everybody watches something different. Everybody has different favorite programs that nobody else has ever heard of. Everybody has, stuff they find on the computer that nobody else does. There's so few things that everybody gets, and if something comes up, like the AIG bonuses or the governor of Illinois, that everybody suddenly knows about. It's so powerful because there are so few frames of reference like that anymore. And that's a big difference for me anyway.
So the other set of questions has to do with the relationship of the press to the Obama administration. So either making sure that David Brooks falls in love with them or that Paul Krugman stops being so mean to them. There's a general sense in some of these questions about during the campaign, both Senator Clinton and Senator McCain had said that the media had basically fallen in love with President Obama. Has that honeymoon ended? And is there still this sense of what some had accused the media of being gaga for Obama?
I always felt it was really ironic that John McCain, who is the one person who most gagaed by the media of all politicians in the history of the 20th century, was the one who suddenly decided that we were against him during this campaign. He ran a terrible campaign, and that did show in the coverage. The Obama people are very conscious of the media. During the campaign, he's not a guy that I would say had like close relationships with anybody in the media. He's a very cool and somewhat remote presence during the campaign. There wasn't, and even his staff, although they were very competent, weren't the kind of staff that people adored or hung out with or quoted obsessively. So the idea that like Obama, what was interesting was Obama was so different and so new that everybody kind of just gravitated toward that new story, as we always do in the media. And Hillary Clinton was such a not new story that I think she suffered a lot from that. But there's a lot of difference between that kind of unfortunate but natural preference and the idea that everybody was in the bag for Obama. I truly don't think that's the case, and I truly think that as this administration goes on and starts to make mistakes, you'll find them complaining about the media just as much as anybody else ever did.
Yeah, my one line or story about the Obama relations with the media, it is true, Obama was not very open to the media. Staff was kind of boring with the media, but I always found they were nice. So like if you'd say something negative about some campaigns, they'd call you up the next morning and say, that was terrible, what you wrote was just completely wrong, you were a complete and total loser. And then the Obama people would call up after you criticized them and said, David, we love you, you're a great guy, we think you're so special. It's so sad you're a complete and total loser. So that always makes me feel better. But my basic line is, if you look at the core demographic that went most gaga over Obama, it was highly educated people who live on the coasts. Well, who works in the media? Highly educated people who work on the coasts. And so that was the essential core of support. I think it's still going because there's just a lot of simpatico. Not personal, but just in terms of worldview.
And I'm just going to return to two policy questions, and then we'll wrap up the conversation. One, because of where we are, there are a number of questions relating to the Obama administration's approach to the Middle East. The Obama campaign, throughout the campaign, worked very hard in trying to reach out to the Jewish community. We're very concerned about how they were being perceived. They received a very large percentage of the vote, yet at least from the questions that were passed forward from the audience, there seems to be this real sense of anxiety of what is potentially coming, either as it relates to what the Obama administration is going to do about Iran, or how the Obama administration is going to deal with the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. And it seems to all come back to this question of, is the Obama administration going to be standing by Israel as its ally in the Middle East, and how is that going to be substantially different from what the Bush administration did and how it understood what that alliance was about?
I think if I understand what David was saying before, I absolutely agree with him, which is that he's not, there's no desire on the part of the Obama administration to do anything that would offend Israel in any serious way, but that's partly because it's not the top thing on their radar. It's that in order, I think, to offend Israel, normally you'd have to actually want to change things in some way or push the peace process forward in some dramatic way that, you know, that the Israeli government would not be happy with. And I don't think I just don't think they have time. I don't think they think it's the most likely, you know, hit for them, and they've got so many other problems out there. I think they'll be happy to keep the status quo as long as possible.
Yeah, though I do think it involves a wide rift between Israel and the U.S. It'll eventually involve a wide rift on Iran as the U.S. becomes to accommodate whatever's going to happen in Iran, and Israel gets more and more upset. And that'll be especially true for Bibi. But even if the Bibi's government fails, which I think this administration expects it to within a year, it'll, you know, Israeli consensus across the parties is very anxious about Iran. And that anxiousness is not felt here. And so I do think there'll be a widening rift. There's clearly more hostility to the West Bank. And this is something, I wouldn't write this because I'm not totally positive about it, but it's something that's being said, which was that Dennis Ross, who I think phenomenally highly of. I think he's one of the truly talented foreign policy people in the country. There's a perception out there by people who know what they're talking about it, that he was hired because the Jews wanted him hired, and now they've got him, they really don't want to use him, and he's really not doing all that much, and he's getting elbowed out of policy thing after policy thing. And I just think that's a gigantic mistake because of what Ross knows about the Middle East, what he knows about Iran, and mostly because he's incredibly savvy about how to run a foreign policy. And I do think that is a little sign of a rift, and it will not be out in the open. The Obama administration and certainly Hillary Clinton understands the position Israel is in, but it will not be what happened in the last 8 years. It will not be a warm relationship, and it could grow to be a frosty relationship, even if Tzipi Livni becomes prime minister in a year or so, just because not that there's difference of views about Iran, but there's a difference of salience or panic about Iran.
But how would that panic translate?
Well, it'll translate into, A, do you put the Iranian issue before the Palestinian issue? It will translate into what kind of price are you willing to pay to really pressure Iran vis-a-vis the Russians? And it could translate, if things get frosty, into settlement, fight, and a zillion things. I mean, it could.
But they're not going to have settlement fights, do you think? I mean, it seems to me like that's the farthest thing from their mind right now.
I think they could have symbolic. I don't think they'll have loan guarantee type fights, but I do think they will have. There will be statements made in a way that were different than Bush, who wouldn't make the statements. I think statements will be made to please, you know, and I'd probably agree with a lot of statements, frankly, but to, you know, the Saudis or the Jordanians will ask them to say this, and they'll say it, and that's something Bush wouldn't have done.
And the last question, and this came up in a couple of questions, is what bit of advice would you give to the Obama administration as to what to focus on in the next 3 years minus 9 months, 3 years, 9 months of the administration after having put so much into the first 3? What should be the centerpiece of the administration?
Well, two things leap out to me. One of the policies they're absolutely perfect on, they're very good on, is education. The education proposal is the best education proposal we've had from an American president in 25 years or maybe forever. But I guess I would focus on something they really don't have time and energy to focus on, which actually is poverty. They haven't really talked about it. During the campaign, Obama talked about spreading Harlem Children's Zone type things around the country. And I guess that would be one thing that he hasn't really gotten to for understandable reasons that I'd ask him to. And then the other thing I would say, focus for a few years on the gigantic mistakes that are bound to happen. I mean, they may get 80% of the stuff right, but 20% will be wrong, and that'll be a huge problem. But I think working that education opportunity is key, because there really is tremendous opportunity to actually make some progress on education reform.
In the perfect world, I would ask them to take it beyond the education agenda into the amazing question to me of how we got to be a country in which we're about to have more than 50% of the workforce is female, in which 40%, I think, of the new births are to single mothers, in which every single woman comes into the world knowing that they're going to have to work for their entire lives, at least off and on. And we've never once tried to figure out who the heck takes care of the children while all this is going on. In 1971, Congress passed a national entitlement for quality early child care for every American, and Richard Nixon vetoed it. And we haven't come back to that issue since. And Michelle Obama was going to make that sort of the centerpiece issue. And I think even after going out there for a while, Michelle Obama became discouraged about the complete impossibility of getting any kind of serious solution to this. But in a perfect world, that would be the thing. If not that, I would say try to figure out how to reform the tax policy to reduce the inequities between the incredibly rich and the rest of the country, and to curb the deficit. That would be my big next step thing for him.
Well, I would like to thank both David Brooks and Gail Collins, and
Thank
also
you.
all of
Thank
you
you very much.
for joining us this evening. And we look forward to seeing you again in the future. Thank you and good night.
Thank you so much.